In the heart of the great continent, where the sun never sleeps and the earth sings with ancient breath, there lay a hidden village named Kaloji. It rested between whispering baobab trees and endless golden plains. But beneath its peace, a story pulsed. A story only whispered in fear. A story of a boy, one whose manhood was not what it seemed. A boy born with a serpent where life should be. A boy whose fate would rattle the bones of the brave. It was the kind of night when the moon weeps quietly through clouds, and the wind moans like a mourning widow. In the heart of Kaloji, under the soft straw roof of a mud brick hut, a child was born. His mother, Naima, was a woman of rare beauty, her skin dark as the night sky, her eyes deep as ancestral wells. She had prayed for this child for years, whispered her hopes to river stones, offered fruit and smoke to the old gods, and the gods, it seemed, had finally answered, but not as she hoped. The midwives huddled around the baby, wiping him clean under the flickering flame. But then one of them gasped. Another drew a sharp breath and fell silent. Old Mama Chitsi, the wisest among them, leaned in closer. Her hands trembled as she saw it. Just below the baby's belly, where a sign of manhood should be, there was something else. A dark, scaly mark. Thin, coiled, and chilling to the touch like the skin of a sleeping snake. Mama Chitsi didn't speak. She only whispered a prayer under her breath, handed the baby back to Naima, and left without a word. Naima never saw her again. Still, she named the boy Weeksa, meaning born of harvest. She hoped the name would change his destiny. But from that moment on, the rains came late. The crops withered, and the people whispered. Weeksa grew tall, lean, and strong. His laughter echoed through the trees like the song of wild birds. His smile could disarm even the grumpiest of elders. But he was different. Naima kept him away from the other children. He bathed alone. He never joined the boys in river games, and no one ever saw him naked. Why does the boy hide? Some asked. What shame does the mother bury? Naima always smiled softly. The spirits marked him for greatness, she said. He must be kept safe. But Baba Tambo, the village healer, saw through the smiles. He had once loved Naima long ago, but her rejection had turned his heart to bitterness. He watched the boy closely, too closely. And one night, under the silver eye of the moon, Baba Tambo followed Weeksa to the river. The boy undressed near the rocks. The healer held his breath. Then he saw it. Where a man's pride should be, a serpent curled black, glistening, alive. It moved slightly as if sensing the cold air. Baba Tambo stumbled backward in horror. This was no child of men. This was the blood of Nguvu, the ancient serpent god banished, forgotten, and feared. Soon the rumor spread like dry fire through the village. Baba Tambo, cloaked in his robes of truth, spoke before the elders. The boy carries a curse, he declared. His presence dries the skies. His seed will poison our land. The elders hesitated. Naima stood before them, proud and calm. My son has done no harm, she said. He carries a mark, yes, but does Kaloji not honor the marked? But fear. Fear is a god stronger than reason. They demanded to see Weeksa. He refused. He stayed locked in their small hut, his chest heavy with confusion. In a bowl of still water, he saw his reflection. The serpent moved beneath his skin. What was he? Before the sun rose, the villagers came with fire. They threw stones, shouted curses, set the roof ablaze. Serpent spawn. Out, demon child. Naima grabbed her son's hand. They ran through smoke and hate into the wild unknown. They carried nothing but a small satchel, dried cassava, and broken hearts. Crossing the river into the cursed plains of Ishangu, Naima fell to her knees. Why do they hate me? Weeksa asked. She held him tightly. Because people destroy what they fear. That night, by a small fire, Naima told him everything. The day of his birth, the serpent mark, the silence of Mama Chitsi. Then she whispered, you must go, far east to the mountains of Kiranji. There you will find a seer. Her name is Ajali. She knows the old ways. She will tell you who you truly are. Weeksa stared into the flames. They danced like serpents. and deep inside him something stirred. Naima was too weak to travel. With tears in his eyes, Weeksa left her under a flowering tree. He promised to return. But even then, they both knew he wouldn't. The journey across Ishangu was cruel. Scorching days, freezing nights, growling shadows in the tall grass. Weeksa's feet bled, his lips cracked, and in his dreams, snakes whispered strange riddles in forgotten tongues. One night, he awoke to find a real snake curled beside him. What? Watching. It didn't strike, just stared. I don't know what I am, he whispered, but I will find out. The snake slithered away. At the edge of the Karanji Mountains, Weeksa stumbled upon a strange village. But this village was silent, too silent. No children laughed. Women wore red veils. Men spoke only in nods. In the center stood a giant, dead baobab, its roots wrapped in rusted chains. Weeksa collapsed near the entrance. They took him in, fed him, wrapped his wounds. A girl named Zubari with eyes like golden honey cared for him. You don't belong here, she said gently. Is it that obvious? He smiled. It screams, she smiled back, but her eyes held pain. She led him to the elder, Mzi Kalum, a blind man whose face looked carved by storms. Kalum touched Weeksa's hand and pulled back sharply. You walk with the spirit of Nguvu, he said. You are not safe here. I seek Ajali. The old man's voice turned dry. She lives beyond the chain tree. But beware. She sees what others fear to know. Ajali's hut was hidden deep in the cliffs, surrounded by bones. She looked older than time, her eyes pale, glowing faintly like distant stars. Weeksa knelt before her. I was born wrong, he said. My mother sent me. She said you would know what I am. Ajali said nothing. She handed him a gourd. Drink. The liquid inside scorched his throat. The world spun. He fell into visions. He saw his own birth, Naima weeping, the serpent god Nguvu chained in the underworld, a war in the skies, a child him with the blood of two worlds, then darkness. When he awoke, Ajali was still watching. You are not cursed, Weeksa, she said softly. You are chosen. But chosen for what? She looked toward the distant mountains. That only your path will reveal. Weeksa left Ajali's hut before dawn. The wind on the cliffs howled like a beast chained in torment, and the sky bled faint orange as night retreated. He carried no map, only her words echoing in his mind. You are not cursed, you are chosen. But chosen for what? He didn't know. All he knew was that the mark on his body, the serpent, was growing. It no longer slept. It twitched. It stirred when he was angry, when he was afraid, sometimes even when he was calm. It was alive. Beyond the mountains of Karanji lay the valley of Tumbra, a place where no trees grew, only sharp black stones and endless wind. In the center of that valley stood a ruin, a collapsed temple swallowed by time and silence. Ajali had whispered of it. There you must go. In the ruins lies the blade of balance. If the blade accepts you, you are the bridge. If it rejects you, the serpent within will consume you. Weeksa walked for days. Dust caked his throat. The serpent under his skin pressed harder, more insistent, like it was guiding him. And then, at the center of the ruin, he saw it. A sword, half buried in stone. Its hilt wrapped in faded gold. Its blade humming with a faint blue pulse. He placed his hands on it. Pain shot through his arm. His eyes went white. He saw flashes, a war of fire and ash, God's bleeding light, serpents falling from the skies, and a voice. You are of both worlds, flesh and scale, light and shadow. You cannot run. The sword lifted slowly as if pulled by destiny itself. It accepted him. But in that same moment, a scream pierced the air. It was Baba Tambo, the healer. He had followed the boy's trail. He had walked across rivers, through storms, and now stood with eyes wild, lips twisted in hatred. You defy nature, abomination, he shouted. You wear the mask of man, but your soul crawls in the dirt like a worm. He raised his staff. The sky cracked. Dark smoke coiled around him like vultures. He had made a pact. Not with gods, but with things older than gods. Weeksor raised the blade of balance. It glowed. The serpent under his skin surged, and for the first time, Weeksor let it rise. From his abdomen, black scales rippled. His pupils slit like a viper's. He slashed the air, and a wave of force knocked Baba Tambo backward. But the old man laughed. You think power makes you righteous? The gods themselves feared your kind. He vanished in smoke, leaving behind only his words. When the red moon rises, all shall kneel. Far across the land, in the village of Kaloji, the sky burned. Naima stood at the river's edge, her heart heavy. She had seen the signs, heard the distant thunder, felt the pull of her son's awakening. The elders were restless. The land was cracking. The crops had not returned. And now Baba Tambo had returned, whispering lies in their ears. The boy has awakened the ancient ones, he hissed. He must be destroyed or we all perish. Some nodded, others wept. But Naima did not beg. She simply walked into her hut, wrapped herself in her old robe, and began painting symbols on her walls. Old symbols, forbidden ones. She would not let her son walk alone. Not again. Weeksor returned to the silent village near Karanji, the one where the tree was chained and silence reigned. Zubri met him at the gate, but her eyes had changed. Where did you go? She asked softly. To the truth, Weeksor replied. He showed her the blade. She flinched, then took his hand. I have something to show you. She led him to a hidden cave behind the chained tree. There, carved into the stone, were murals ancient ones. Snakes with wings, men with fangs, children born with tails and golden eyes. One of them looked like Weeksor. Zubri turned to him. My grandmother told me the stories. The serpent's sons were guardians once, before they were hunted. My blood, Weeksor whispered. It's not evil, it's ancient. But as he traced the carvings with his fingers, a shadow moved behind them. Someone was listening. That night, Weeksor dreamed again. This time he stood before a river of fire. Naima stood on one side, Ajali on the other. In between, Baba Tambo laughed with a crown of snakes on his head. You think you're special? The healer growled. You're a mistake that never should have drawn breath. Then he pushed Naima into the fire. Weeksor screamed. He woke in a cold sweat, gasping. Zubri was beside him. She looked afraid but not of him, of what was coming. The red moon rises tonight, she said. Everything will change. And it did. That night, the moon turned crimson. A soundless scream echoed across the valley. The chains around the baobab shattered. From the roots, black smoke hissed and a creature rose. Tall, twisted, cloaked in bones. Baba Tambo had become something else. A shadow taker. He pointed a bony finger at Weeksor. Your kind should have died in the womb. Weeksor stepped forward, blade in hand. You fear me because I'm not like you, he said. That's not my curse. That's your weakness. The final battle had begun. The sky above Kaloji turned the color of rusted iron. Stars flickered like dying embers, and the red moon cast a glow that made the trees look like ghosts rising from the earth. Weeksor stood at the heart of the ancient battlefield, his blade humming with ancient energy. Across from him towered the shadow taker, once Baba Tambo, now something far more sinister. The villagers had gathered, drawn by the whispers in their blood. Some came with fear, others with torches, but none spoke. They watched as man and monster faced each other. The blade pulsed. The serpent beneath Weeksor's skin writhed. You were supposed to be forgotten, hissed the shadow taker. Buried in the sand with your ancestors. Weeksor raised his sword, and with a roar that shook the cliffs they clashed. The battle was not of muscle and bone alone. It was a war of spirit. Each strike carried memory. Each parry echoed with screams of the past. Weeksor saw flashes of children hunted, of temples burned, of mothers weeping over scaly corpses. And yet he stood. Blood trickled from his mouth. His arms ached, but the sword burned brighter, until the shadow taker lunged with black fire and pierced Weeksor's chest. The boy fell. Silence. The villagers gasped. Naima ran to his side, eyes wide with terror. But as the monster stepped forward, triumphant, the blade of balance lifted on its own, floating, spinning, it shot forward, and impaled the shadow taker in the heart. His scream split the skies, and the red moon began to fade. Weeksa did not rise. He lay in his mother's arms, breath shallow. The blade had returned to his side, glowing faintly. Naima wept. "I never wanted you to suffer," she whispered. "But maybe you were born to awaken the sleeping bones of the world." Zubri approached. Her fingers brushed Weeksa's face. Suddenly the serpent under his skin surged. It coiled around his ribcage, moved up his spine, and with a blinding light it entered his heart. His eyes snapped open, but now they glowed gold. He rose slowly, not fully human, not fully serpent, but something new, something balanced. The villagers didn't cheer. They stepped back. Fear still clung to their faces. They had seen him die and rise, and they didn't know what to call him now. Some whispered God, others hissed demon, and from the crowd an elder stepped forth. He pointed at Weeksa. "You are no longer one of us." Weeksa met his gaze. "I never was." He turned to Naima. Her eyes held both pride and pain. "You must go," she whispered, "before they try to bind you again." Zubri reached for his hand. "I'll go with you," she said, and so they walked out of Kaloji, past the shattered tree, into the wilds of the unknown. They crossed the wailing canyons where winds screamed like mourning women. They slept in caves where shadows danced on walls. Each night, Weeksa's powers deepened. He could feel the hearts of birds beating in the trees. He could smell storms before they broke. He could even hear the whispers of ancient stones. But he also felt the serpent's hunger. He wanted more. Not blood, but memory. One night, under a silver moon, he asked Zubri, "What am I becoming?" She looked at him. Something the world forgot to make room for. In the northern desert of Isanjo, they found them. Others, men and women with the mark of the serpent. Hidden, hunted, surviving in silence. The Serpent Council welcomed Weeksa with firelight and cautious stares. An elder named Mambo spoke. "You carry the blade. You awaken the bloodline. You must lead us." Weeksa hesitated. "I don't want power." Mambo smiled. "Power is not given. It's taken or it's earned. You've already done both." That night, Weeksa sat by the fire. He looked into the flames and saw the face of Baba Tambo, still alive, still burning, still watching. The desert winds of Isanjo blew hot and dry, but the fire inside Weeksa burned hotter. Each night the visions returned, shadows slithering through ancient corridors, a red-eyed serpent wrapped around a broken throne, and the voice of Baba Tambo, chanting from somewhere beneath the earth. The world must bleed to remember who ruled it first. Weeksa sat alone by the fire, his eyes flickering like coals. The Serpent Council slept, unaware that their new leader was changing. Zubri noticed first. "You don't sleep anymore," she whispered. "You barely speak." "I don't have time," Weeksa replied, voice flat. "The storm is coming, and I must be its eye." At dawn, Mambo gathered the council. Around a sacred stone shaped like a coiled serpent, they cut their palms and pressed them to the rock, sealing an ancient pact. "We do not crawl. We strike. We do not beg. We bite. We do not hide. We rise." Weeksa stood at the center, holding the blade of balance. It now shimmered with dark veins of obsidian, as if the serpent inside him was feeding on its energy. A young warrior named Tao stepped forward. He challenged Weeksa's right to lead, demanding a duel, a test of Fang and fire. Weeksa didn't hesitate. In 3 moves, Tao lay face down in the sand, his pride shattered like dried clay. And the council bowed, not out of love, out of fear. Far from Isanjo, in the village of Kaloji, Naima wandered alone. The people had driven her out. They said she had birthed a demon, that her womb had betrayed the ancestors. But in exile, Naima found something unexpected. An ancient cave filled with carvings, serpents and stars, gods and flames, and a single word etched over and over: Mwana Wamoto, child of fire. She touched the wall, and a hidden door creaked open. Behind it, a library of bones and scrolls. A voice echoed, "The serpent was never the curse. It was the warning." Deep underground, Baba Tambo, or what remained of him, sat upon a throne of skulls. His body was cracked, his flesh burned, but his spirit pulsed like a drumbeat of vengeance. Beside him stood a beast, half man, half serpent, born of blood rituals and forgotten gods. He called it Nkasi the Devourer. "Weeksa thinks he controls the serpent," Tambo rasped, "but he only borrowed its tail. I hold the head." He raised a staff of bone. Across the continent, volcanoes stirred. The old gods turned in their sleep, and in the sky the red moon returned. Weeksa's body grew stronger, his senses sharper. He could hear thunder before clouds formed. He could smell fear like smoke. But the more he embraced the power, the more he heard the serpent's voice. "Take it all," it whispered. "Burn them all." One night, Zubri confronted him. "This power, it's poisoning you." "No," Weeksa growled. "It's freeing me." "You're starting to sound like him," she said softly. Weeksa froze. Then, with a voice heavy with pain, he said, "I'm not sure who I am anymore." He stared at his reflection in a pool of water, and saw not a boy, not a man, but a god coiled in rage. Naima journeyed north, scrolls in hand, to find the one tribe that remembered the old ways, the Njoka nomads. They lived on the backs of giant tortoises, migrating across the plains, singing to the stars. Their leader, Elder Shani, read her scrolls and wept. "It has begun again," she said. "The war that scorched the skies, the war of serpents and suns." They gathered warriors, shamans, wind callers, and Naima, once cast out, now led them to the edge of the world, to stand beside her son or to stop him, whichever fate required. Weeksa and the Serpent Council arrived at the ruins of Mbali Kazi, a city buried in sand for centuries. There at the center was the forgotten altar, said to be the birthplace of all serpent bloodlines. He placed the blade upon it. The sky turned black. A pillar of fire shot upward, and from the shadows Nkasi emerged. The beast snarled, eyes burning like coals. And Baba Tambo's voice filled the air. "Son of mine, child of fire, your flame is borrowed, and now I've come to collect." The altar burned. The sand turned to glass beneath their feet. Lightning coiled around the sky like serpents made of light. And Weeksa stood frozen, not out of fear, but from the weight of memory crashing back. Visions assaulted him. The cave where he was born. The night his father vanished into the dark. The fire inside him, never his to control, but always his to carry. Nkasi stepped forward, muscles rippling like stone come alive. From behind, the Serpent Council drew their blades. Zubri reached for Weeksa's hand, but he pulled away. "This is mine to end," he said. Alone. The clash was thunderous. Weeksa launched himself at Nkasi, blade slicing through air and flame. Nkasi met him with raw strength. Swiping, snarling, a whirlwind of fury. Fire met claw. Steel met scale. Each strike shook the earth. Each scream split the heavens. Baba Tambo stood at the edge, chanting, his voice opening old wounds in the soil. "Let fire consume flesh. Let the serpent eat its own." Suddenly Naima's voice rose in the wind. She stood atop a dune, arms outstretched, chanting in the ancient tongue. The flame was never a curse, but the mirror of truth. Kasi faltered. His form flickered, and Weeksa saw it beneath the beast's face, his father's eyes. "Baba," he whispered. Nkasi roared, but something within him trembled. The ritual had gone too far. Nkasi was both prisoner and puppet, a soul chained inside scales and rage. Weeksa dropped his blade. "If I strike you now," he said, "I become the monster you tried to raise me to be." The fire around them dimmed. Tambo screamed in fury. Lightning struck him not from the heavens, but from within the altar itself. The gods had spoken, and they were done with him. The blade of balance cracked. Its shards rose into the sky, spinning, glowing, becoming embers. Each shard flew into a warrior's heart. Zubri, Naima, Tao, Elder Shani each became part of the flame. Wixa walked toward Nkasi and placed his forehead against the beast's. I forgive what you became. I mourn what you were. Nkasi exhaled one final breath and crumbled into ash. Baba Tambo's body disintegrated, his spirit pulled into the altar, screaming as the gods reclaimed what he stole. The fire cooled, the sand settled, and dawn broke for the first time in 100 years. Wixa stood before the people of Kaloji and Isanjo. His serpent mark faded, but his fire still glowed beneath the skin. Naima placed a crown of woven copper on his head. Not a king's crown, a guardian's. Zubri spoke to the gathered tribes. He is no god, he is no demon. He is the choice we must all make between fury and forgiveness. Under Wixa's rule, the tribes rebuilt what war had burned. The serpent cult dissolved, its secret sealed beneath Mbalikazi. But the flame of wisdom that remained, passed from tongue to tongue, story to story, until it reached us. What if the greatest battle wasn't between fire and fong but between the truth we fear and the self we hide? Wixa's journey is a mirror for us all. In the heat of rage, do we burn the world or forge it anew? As I watched this tale unfold, I realized Wixa wasn't just a character, he was a symbol. We all carry fire within us. Some of us bury it, some let it consume us, but the rare few learn to shape it into light. The serpent within is not evil. It's instinct, power, potential. Left unchecked, it destroys. Understood, it transforms. This African tale, though wrapped in myth and magic, speaks of real choices. Do we repeat the pain of our past, or forge new legacies? Do we fear the parts of ourselves we don't understand, or do we face them and find our strength? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more tales that dig beneath the surface and awaken something ancient within us. Let's keep these stories alive, not just to remember the past, but to shape the future. Because sometimes it takes a serpent to remind us how human we truly are.